On a rainy Wednesday night in Chicago, Nathan Rivers carried his sleeping daughter through the lobby of Hartwell Industries headquarters. Her small arms wrapped around his neck, her backpack bumping against his hip with every step. He was 37 years old, a senior financial analyst, and he had exactly 8 hours to complete a report that should have taken 4 days. The fluorescent lights above him flickered once as he stepped into the elevator, and Emma stirred against his shoulder, murmuring something about waffles. Nathan pressed the button for the 38th floor and closed his eyes just for a moment, feeling the weight of everything he was about to lose if he failed. The office was nearly empty when he arrived, just a few junior associates scattered across the open floor plan, their faces illuminated by the pale glow of their monitors. Nathan found a corner desk near the window and carefully lowered Emma into an ergonomic chair, tucking his jacket around her like a blanket. She was 7 years old, with her mother's blonde hair and his own stubborn chin, and she had spent more nights in this building over the past month than any child ever should. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead and whispered that he would be right here, that everything would be fine, that she just needed to sleep a little longer. He had just opened his laptop when he heard the sharp click of heels against marble. Sophie Hartwell stood at the end of the hallway, her silhouette framed by the city lights behind her. She was 33 years old, the youngest CEO in the company's history, and she had inherited the position after her father's sudden death 2 years ago. Everything about her suggested control, from the precise cut of her navy blazer to the way she held her tablet like a shield against the world. She walked toward Nathan without greeting him, her eyes scanning the spreadsheet on his screen. The Zenith analysis. I need it on my desk by 7 tomorrow morning. Complete projections, risk assessment, and competitor benchmarks. Nathan glanced at the clock in the corner of his monitor. It was already midnight. Miss Hartwell, I've been here since 8 this morning. The data you're asking for requires access to files that aren't even... Then get access. Her voice carried no emotion, no acknowledgement that he was a human being rather than a machine designed to process her demands. If you can't handle the pressure, Mr. Rivers, perhaps you're not suited for Hartwell Industries. She turned to leave, and her gaze passed briefly over Emma's sleeping form. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across Sophie's face, something that might have been recognition, or confusion, or even guilt, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, and she continued walking without another word. Nathan watched her disappear around the corner, his jaw tight, his hands trembling slightly as he returned to his keyboard. He thought about his health insurance, about Emma's upcoming dental appointment, about the rent that was due in 10 days. He thought about the promises he had made to his daughter and the ones he had made to himself, back when he believed that working hard was enough to guarantee a decent life. He began typing, and he did not stop. The weeks that followed carved deep lines into Nathan's face and stripped away whatever reserves of energy he had left. Sophie assigned him 2 additional projects before the Zenith analysis was even complete, explaining in her clipped, efficient way that she was testing his capacity for growth. She scheduled meetings at 5:30 in the morning and conference calls at 11 at night, always with the implicit understanding that attendance was not optional. Other employees whispered in the break room about Nathan's obvious exhaustion, about the dark circles under his eyes and the slight tremor in his hands, but no one said anything directly. They had seen what happened to people who pushed back against Sophie Hartwell. At home, Nathan worked until the numbers blurred together on his screen. Emma sat beside him at the kitchen table, coloring in a book of animals, occasionally looking up to ask if he was almost done. He always told her yes, just a few more minutes, even when he knew it would be hours. One night she asked if they could go to the zoo on Saturday, and he promised they would. And then Saturday came, and he spent the entire day on a video call with investors in Tokyo, while Emma watched cartoons alone in the living room. He discovered the errors by accident late on a Thursday night when he was cross-referencing data for a quarterly report. 3 separate miscalculations in a document that bore Sophie's signature. Mistakes that had somehow survived multiple reviews and were now embedded in the company's official records. Anyone else might have ignored them, might have reasoned that correcting the CEO's work was a fast track to unemployment. But Nathan had been raised by a father who believed that integrity was the only thing a man truly owned. And so he fixed the numbers without telling anyone. He saved the corrected version and deleted any trace of the original, protecting the company from potential liability while asking for nothing in return. The early morning meeting was held in the glass-walled conference room on the 39th floor, the one with the view of Millennium Park that Sophie used to intimidate clients and employees alike. Nathan arrived at 5:45, with Emma still half asleep beside him, her small hand gripping his as they navigated the empty hallways. He found a chair in the corridor outside the conference room and helped her settle in, promising that he would be right on the other side of the glass, that she could wave to him if she needed anything. Inside, a dozen executives sat around the polished table, their expressions carefully neutral as they waited for the presentation to begin. And then one of the investors from Greystone interrupted her. "There's a discrepancy in Section 4, he said, scrolling through his tablet. "The risk calculations in this version don't match what we saw in the preliminary report." The room fell silent. Sophie's face remained composed, but Nathan could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight narrowing of her eyes as she tried to reconcile what she was hearing with what she believed to be true. "I made those corrections," Nathan said. Every head in the room turned toward him. He felt the weight of their attention like a physical force pressing against his chest, making it difficult to breathe. But he continued anyway. "The original calculations contained several errors that would have overstated our risk exposure by approximately 14%. I identified the issues during my review and updated the figures to reflect accurate projections." The investor from Greystone studied Nathan for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "That's exactly the kind of diligence we like to see. Miss Hartwell, you've got a sharp analyst on your team." Sophie said nothing. She simply stared at Nathan with an expression she could not read, something between surprise and reassessment, as if she were seeing him clearly for the first time. The meeting continued, but she never quite regained her equilibrium. And when it ended, she left the room without speaking to anyone. Nathan returned to the hallway to find Emma still sleeping in her chair, her head tilted at an uncomfortable angle. He lifted her gently and carried her toward the elevator, wondering if he had just made the worst mistake of his career. The exhaustion accumulated like sediment at the bottom of a river. Layer upon layer of sleepless nights and missed meals and promises he could not keep. Nathan's hands began to tingle during meetings, a pins and needles sensation that started in his fingertips and spread upward to his wrists. He developed headaches that no amount of aspirin could touch, dull throbs behind his eyes that made it difficult to focus on the endless columns of numbers. He lost 9 pounds in 3 weeks without trying, his body consuming itself to fuel the machine that Sophie Hartwell demanded he become. The spring carnival was supposed to be different. He had circled the date on the calendar months ago, back when his workload was still manageable and weekends still belonged to him. Emma had talked about it constantly, about the face painting and the pony rides and the cotton candy that her friend Mia's mother had described in elaborate detail. She had picked out her costume, a pink fairy dress and a wand covered in glitter, and she had practiced her parade wave in the mirror every night before bed. But the night before the carnival, Sophie sent an email marked urgent, demanding a complete revision of the Pemberton acquisition files. The work would take 14 hours at minimum, and the deadline was Monday morning, and Nathan knew with absolute certainty that he could not do both. He tried to explain to Emma, kneeling beside her bed while she clutched her fairy wand and stared at him with eyes that were too old for her face. He told her that sometimes grown-ups had to make difficult choices, that he would make it up to her next year, that he was so sorry. She did not cry. She simply turned away from him and faced the wall, and he heard her whisper so quietly that he almost missed it. "You always say that, Daddy." He worked through the night while she slept, and he worked through the morning while she ate cereal alone in the kitchen. And by the time the carnival was over, he had finished the revision and sent it to Sophie with 4 hours to spare. But when he went to check on Emma, he found her sitting on her bed with her costume still folded neatly in her lap, her eyes red from crying, and he understood that some things could not be fixed with apologies or promises. On Friday afternoon, Sophie called him into her office for a briefing on the Morrison merger. It was supposed to take 30 minutes. It took 5 hours. When she finally dismissed him, she mentioned almost casually that she needed additional documentation by Monday, that he should plan to work through the weekend, and the company's needs had to come before personal considerations. Nathan looked at her across the vast expanse of her oak desk, at the expensive art on her walls and the awards on her shelves, and the absolute certainty in her eyes. And for the first time in his career at Hartwell Industries, he said no. "I can't do it," he said, his voice steady, despite the fear that coiled in his stomach. "I have a daughter who needs me. I've already missed her carnival, her parent-teacher conference, 4 bedtimes this week alone. I'm not missing anything else." Sophie's expression did not change, but something shifted behind her eyes, some recalibration of the assumptions she had made about who he was and what he would tolerate. She was not accustomed to hearing that word from anyone, least of all from an employee whose entire livelihood depended on her approval. "I see," she said finally. "We'll discuss this on Monday." She did not sound angry. She sounded curious, and somehow that was worse. The little girl in the hallway could not have been more than 6 or 7 years old, with tangled brown hair and a butterfly backpack that had seen better days. She was curled up in one of the leather chairs outside the executive conference room, her knees drawn to her chest, her eyes closed in exhausted sleep. A secretary walked past without glancing at her. A junior associate stepped over her extended legs without breaking stride. It was as if she had become invisible, a piece of furniture that everyone had agreed to ignore. Sophie noticed her on a Monday afternoon between meetings with the board and a conference call with investors in Frankfurt. She had seen Emma before, of course, had registered her presence in the same way she registered the potted plants in the lobby or the motivational posters in the break room. But something was different today. Maybe it was the way the girl's hand clutched the strap of her backpack even in sleep, or the slight furrow in her brow, or the faded stain on her jacket that suggested a breakfast eaten too quickly in the back of a taxi. Sophie stood in the hallway for nearly a minute watching. Behind her, she could hear 2 assistants whispering, their voices just low enough that they thought she could not hear. "Poor thing's been here since 5:30 this morning," one of them said. "Her dad's in the Pemberton Review. You know how those go. Someone should call child services. It's not right bringing a kid to a place like this. Tell that to Hartwell. She's the one working him to death." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through something Sophie had kept carefully submerged. She turned and walked back to her office without speaking to anyone, her heels clicking against the marble floor in a rhythm that suddenly felt too fast, too sharp, too much like running away. That night, alone in her penthouse apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, Sophie opened her laptop and began reading. She pulled up every report Nathan had submitted over the past 7 months, every analysis, every projection, every hastily written email sent at hours when no reasonable person should be awake. She read about risk assessments and market fluctuations and quarterly growth targets, but what she really saw was something else entirely. She saw a man who had caught errors that 3 senior executives had missed. She saw a man who had worked through holidays and weekends and his daughter's carnival without complaint. She saw a man who had given Hartwell Industries everything he had. And what had she given him in return? She closed the laptop and stared at her reflection in the darkened window, and she did not like what she saw. The collapse happened on a Thursday in the elevator between the 38th and 39th floors. Nathan had just finished the final revision of the Morrison Report, 78 pages of analysis that represented the culmination of 2 weeks of work with almost no sleep. He had sent it to Sophie's inbox with a sense of hollow triumph, the kind of victory that felt more like surrender, and he had gathered his things to go home and finally rest. He made it 4 steps into the elevator before his vision blurred. The world tilted sideways, his legs buckled, and the last thing he heard before everything went dark was Emma screaming his name. When he opened his eyes, he was lying on the cold marble floor of the lobby, surrounded by a circle of concerned faces. Someone had loosened his tie and propped his head on a folded jacket. Someone else was calling for an ambulance. And kneeling beside him, her designer suit forgotten, her careful composure finally cracked, was Sophie Hartwell. "Don't try to move," she said, and her voice sounded strange, almost human. "Help is coming." Emma was crying somewhere nearby, great heaving sobs that cut through the ambient noise of the lobby like a knife. Nathan tried to turn toward her, tried to tell her that everything was fine, that Daddy was just tired, that there was nothing to worry about, but his body would not cooperate, and his vision kept sliding in and out of focus. And then Sophie was doing something he never would have expected. She stood, walked over to Emma, and knelt down to meet her eyes. "Your father is going to be okay," Sophie said quietly. "I promise. I'm going to make sure of it." She took Emma's hand and led her back to where Nathan lay, and she stayed there until the paramedics arrived, her fingers wrapped around the small hand of a child she had never spoken to before that moment. The hospital room was small and white and smelled of antiseptic. Nathan spent 2 days there, hooked up to monitors that beeped at irregular intervals, while doctors explained that his body had simply shut down from exhaustion. Severe fatigue, they called it, burnout, the kind of total systemic collapse that happened when a person pushed themselves past every reasonable limit and then kept pushing. Nathan stayed with Nathan's neighbor, a retired librarian named Dorothy, who had helped out before during late nights at the office. Nathan called her every few hours, listening to his daughter's voice on the phone, promising that he would be home soon, that everything would be different now, that he was so sorry for scaring her. On the second night, a nurse mentioned that someone had paid for his room to be upgraded to a private suite. Nathan assumed it was a billing error and did not ask questions. He was discharged on a Saturday morning with strict instructions to rest for at least 3 weeks and reduce his stress levels significantly. He laughed when the doctor said that last part, a hollow sound that echoed off the hospital walls. The doctor looked at him with an expression of genuine concern. "I mean it," she said. "Whatever you've been doing, it almost killed you. You need to make changes." Nathan nodded and signed the discharge papers and took a taxi back to his apartment in Lincoln Park. Emma was waiting for him at the door, her face pressed against the glass, and when he walked in, she threw her arms around his waist and held on like she would never let go. "You thought you were going to die, like Mommy did." He knelt down and held her, and he made promises he was not sure he could keep, and he tried not to think about what would happen when his medical leave ended and he had to return to Hartwell Industries. The apartment was quiet after Emma fell asleep. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic from the street below. Nathan sat in the darkness of his living room, too tired to read, too wired to sleep, his mind running through scenarios and calculations like a computer that could not be shut down. He wondered if Sophie had already found his replacement, if his desk had been cleared out, if anyone at the office would remember his name in 6 months. The knock came at exactly midnight. He thought at first that he was imagining it, some artifact of exhaustion or medication. But then it came again, 3 sharp raps against the thin wood of his door, and he rose from the couch with a growing sense of unreality. Sophie Hartwell stood in his hallway. She was wearing a gray wool coat that looked out of place in his building, and her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and there was no trace of makeup on her face. She looked younger without the armor of her professional appearance, younger and more uncertain than he had ever seen her. "I know it's late," she said, "and I know I have no right to be here, but I couldn't wait until Monday. I couldn't—" She stopped, took a breath, started again. "I need to apologize, and I needed to do it in person." Nathan stared at her for a long moment, trying to reconcile the woman in his doorway with the one who had driven him to collapse. He should have been angry. He should have told her to leave, to send her apologies through HR like a normal person, to let him recover in peace. But something in her expression stopped him, something raw and genuine that he had never seen in the polished conference rooms of Hartwell Industries. "It's midnight," he said. "I know. You're at my apartment. I know that too." He stepped back from the door. "Then you'd better come in." She entered his living room like a visitor to a foreign country, her eyes moving across the second-hand furniture and the crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator and the small mountain of medical bills on the kitchen counter. In her hands, she carried a box wrapped in bright paper, and she held it in front of her like an offering. "I saw your daughter looking at this in a store window about a month ago. I was passing by in my car and I saw her standing there with her nose pressed against the glass, and I didn't stop. I should have stopped. I should have done a lot of things differently." Nathan took the box from her hands. Through the wrapping, he could see the outline of a stuffed animal, something soft and blue with what looked like a horn. "Miss Hartwell." "Sophie," she interrupted, "please, I think we're past professional titles at this point." Sophie? The name felt strange in his mouth, too intimate for what they had been to each other. "I don't understand. Why are you here? Why now?" She sat down on his couch without being invited, and for a moment she looked almost lost, like a woman who had spent her entire life navigating by a map that had suddenly become useless. "I've been thinking about something my father told me," she said slowly, "before he died, when he was handing over the company. He said that the hardest part of leadership wasn't making decisions, it was living with the consequences of those decisions, even when you couldn't see them." She looked up at him, and her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. "I made decisions about you, Nathan, about your time, your health, your relationship with your daughter, and I never once stopped to think about what those decisions were costing you. I just saw numbers on a spreadsheet, performance metrics, productivity reports. I didn't see a person, and I'm more sorry for that than I know how to say." The silence stretched between them, filled with everything that had happened and everything that might happen next. And then a small voice came from the hallway. "Daddy, who's at the door?" Emma stood in her pajamas, rubbing her eyes with one hand and clutching her stuffed bunny with the other. She looked at Sophie with the unfiltered curiosity of childhood, no recognition in her face, no understanding of who this woman was or what she represented. "This is Miss Hartwell," Nathan said carefully. "She's someone I work with. She came to visit." "In the nighttime?" Sophie rose from the couch and walked over to Emma, crouching down so they were at eye level. "I came to bring you something, and to tell your father that I'm sorry for making him miss so much time with you." She reached for the wrapped box and held it out to Emma, who looked at her father for permission before taking it. The paper came off in excited strips, revealing a stuffed unicorn with blue fur and a shimmering horn, exactly like the one she had admired in the store window all those weeks ago. Emma's face lit up with pure joy. "It's the unicorn, Daddy! It's the unicorn!" She hugged it to her chest and then did something unexpected. She stepped forward and hugged Sophie too, her small arms wrapping around the billionaire's neck with the unself-conscious affection of a child who had not yet learned to be suspicious of kindness. "Thank you," she whispered. "Would you like to come inside and see my room?" Sophie looked at Nathan over Emma's shoulder, a question in her eyes. He nodded. The next 2 hours were unlike anything Nathan could have imagined. He watched Sophie Hartwell, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation, sit on his daughter's twin bed and listen to detailed descriptions of every stuffed animal in the collection. He watched her examine crayon drawings with the same intensity she brought to quarterly reports. He watched her laugh at Emma's jokes, genuine laughter that transformed her face into something almost unrecognizable. When Emma finally fell asleep again, her new unicorn tucked under her arm, Sophie and Nathan returned to the living room. The clock on the wall read 2:45 in the morning. "I should go," Sophie said, but she made no move toward the door. "You need to rest. So do you." She smiled, a small, tired expression that looked nothing like the polished mask she wore at the office. "I don't remember the last time I rested. Not really. I think I've been running for so long that I forgot how to stop." Nathan sat down beside her on the couch, close enough to see the faint lines around her eyes, the vulnerability she usually kept so carefully hidden. "Why did you really come here tonight?" "Because I watched you collapse," she said, quietly, "and I realized that I did that. Me, my expectations, my demands, my complete inability to see you as anything other than a resource to be optimized. I've spent 2 years running my father's company, and I've never once asked myself what kind of person that company was making me become." She turned to face him, and there was something in her expression that Nathan had never seen before, something that looked almost like hope. "I want to be different," she said. "I want to be the kind of leader my father would have been proud of, and I want to start by making things right with you." The morning after Sophie's midnight visit, Nathan woke to find Emma already up, sitting at the kitchen table with her new unicorn and a bowl of cereal. She looked happier than she had in months, chattering away about how nice Miss Hartwell was, how she smelled like flowers, how she had promised to come back and see the rest of Emma's drawings. Nathan listened and smiled and tried to quiet the voice in his head that warned him about trusting billionaires who showed up at midnight with gifts and apologies. People like Sophie didn't change overnight. People like Sophie didn't change at all. But then he thought about the look in her eyes when she had held Emma, the genuine warmth that no amount of corporate training could fake. And he thought about his own exhaustion, his own inability to keep going the way he had been going. And he wondered if maybe, just maybe, they could help each other find a different path. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Sophie. "I meant what I said last night. Can we meet tomorrow to discuss a new arrangement, somewhere neutral? I have ideas." He read the message 3 times before responding. "Okay, name the place." They met at a coffee shop in the Loop, a place Nathan had walked past 100 times but never entered because the prices were absurd and the clientele looked like they had never worried about money in their lives. Sophie was already there when he arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups in front of her, and she stood when she saw him, a gesture of respect that caught him off guard. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure either." They sat across from each other, the table between them like a negotiating barrier, and Sophie began to talk. She told him about growing up in her father's shadow, about inheriting a company she wasn't prepared to run, about the pressure she had put on herself to prove that she deserved her position. She told him about the mistakes she had made, the people she had hurt, the relationships she had destroyed in her pursuit of perfection. "I'm not asking for sympathy," she said. "I'm asking for a chance to do better, and I want to start with you." She pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. Inside was a proposal for a new position, a role that would give Nathan more autonomy, better hours, and a guaranteed minimum number of vacation days. It was everything he had wanted and more than he had ever thought to ask for. "This is too much," he said, staring at the numbers. "It's not enough," she replied. "Not after what I put you through, but it's a start." He looked up at her, searching her face for signs of deception or manipulation, and found nothing but sincerity. "Why me? You have thousands of employees. Why focus all this energy on one analyst?" Sophie was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Because you were the one who taught me that I was doing something wrong. When you corrected those errors in my report, you could have used them against me. You could have gone to the board or leaked them to the press or demanded a promotion in exchange for your silence. But you didn't. You fixed the problem and moved on, because you cared more about doing the right thing than about what you could gain from it." She reached across the table and touched his hand, just briefly, just enough to make her point. "I've been surrounded by people who tell me what I want to hear, people who are afraid of me, or who want something from me, or who see me as a stepping stone to their own success. You were different. You told me no when I deserved to hear no, and you showed me what integrity looks like, even when no one's watching." Nathan thought about his father, about the lessons he had tried to pass down, about the importance of doing the right thing even when it was hard. He thought about Emma asleep in her bed with a blue unicorn, and about the kind of example he wanted to set for her. "I'll think about it," he said, and Sophie nodded, and for the first time, she smiled. "That's all I ask." The weeks that followed were strange and uncertain, a liminal space between what had been and what might be. Nathan returned to work on a modified schedule, his hours reduced, his workload manageable, his weekends once again his own. He picked Emma up from school in the afternoons and took her to the park on Saturdays and tucked her into bed every night without the weight of unfinished reports pressing against his chest. And Sophie changed too. She held fewer meetings, delegated more responsibilities, started leaving the office before sunset. She asked her employees about their families and remembered their answers. She apologized publicly for the culture of overwork she had created and announced new policies designed to protect her staff from the kind of burnout that had nearly killed Nathan. Not everyone believed her transformation was real. Rumors circulated through the office like wildfire, speculation about her motives, her sanity, her secret agenda. Some people whispered that she was having a breakdown. Others suggested that she was being blackmailed. A few even claimed that she and Nathan were having an affair, that the whole thing was just elaborate theater to cover a workplace romance. The gossip reached Nathan through sideways glances and conversations that stopped abruptly when he entered the room. He tried to ignore it, tried to focus on his work and his daughter and the slow, careful rebuilding of his life. But the whispers wormed their way under his skin, making him question every interaction with Sophie, every smile she gave him, every moment of kindness he had started to believe might be genuine. One afternoon, he confronted her about it. "People are talking," he said, standing in the doorway of her office, "about us. About what's really going on here." Sophie looked up from her laptop, and there was something in her expression that he could not quite read. "I know," she said, turning a pen in her fingers. "What bothers me," she said slowly, "is that you might believe them, that you might think everything I've done was just manipulation or performance or some kind of elaborate game." She stood and walked around her desk, stopping a few feet away from him. "I don't care what anyone else thinks. I care what you think. And if you've started to doubt—" "I haven't," he said, and he was surprised to realize it was true. "I haven't." They stood there for a moment, the space between them charged with something neither of them was ready to name. And then Sophie's phone buzzed, breaking the spell, and she turned away to answer it. And Nathan walked back to his desk with more questions than he had come in with. The crisis came on a Friday afternoon, 2 months after Nathan's collapse and 7 weeks after Sophie's midnight visit. Emma was supposed to be at Dorothy's house after school, the same arrangement they had used for years, But when Nathan called to check in, there was no answer. He called again, and then he called the school, and the secretary told him in a voice tight with concern that Emma had been picked up by someone claiming to be her aunt. Nathan did not have a sister. His ex-wife's family lived in Texas and had not spoken to him since the divorce. He was out of his office and into the elevator before he finished processing what he had heard, his heart pounding, his hands shaking, his mind racing through every terrible possibility. He called the police. He called Dorothy. He called everyone he could think of who might know where his daughter was, and no one had any answers. Sophie found him in the lobby, pacing in circles, his phone pressed to his ear, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. She listened to him explain what had happened, and then she did something that surprised him. She took charge. Within an hour, she had mobilized the full resources of Hartwell Industries in the search for Emma. Security teams, private investigators, connections at the Chicago PD who owed her favors. She called in every chip she had, every relationship she had cultivated, every tool at her disposal, and she directed it all toward one goal: finding Nathan's daughter. They worked through the night, reviewing security footage, interviewing witnesses, tracking down leads that went nowhere. Nathan was exhausted and terrified and grateful in ways he could not articulate. And somewhere around 3 a.m, when the fear became too much to bear alone, he let Sophie hold his hand. The breakthrough came at dawn. A security camera at a bus station in Indiana had captured an image of Emma with a woman who matched the description of someone the school secretary remembered seeing. The police traced the woman to a motel 25 miles away, and by noon they had Emma back in Nathan's arms. The woman was his ex-wife's cousin, a person he had met exactly once at a wedding 8 years ago. She had convinced herself that Emma was being neglected, that she was rescuing the girl from a bad situation, that she was doing the right thing. The police arrested her, and social services got involved, and for a few terrible hours, Nathan was forced to prove that he was a fit parent, that his daughter was safe with him, that he had not somehow brought this on himself through his own failures. Sophie stayed with him through all of it. She sat beside him in the police station and stood behind him in the social worker's office and held Emma's hand when the little girl finally started to cry. She did not ask for gratitude or acknowledgement or anything in return. She simply was there, steady and certain, a presence that Nathan had never expected and was not sure he deserved. When it was over, when Emma was asleep in her own bed and the apartment was finally quiet, Sophie sat with Nathan on his couch and watched the sun set over Lincoln Park. "Thank you," he said. "I don't know I can't even begin to. You don't have to thank me. I would do it again. I would do anything for that little girl." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "And for you, if you'd let me." Nathan looked at her, at this woman who had started as his tormentor and become something else entirely, something he was only beginning to understand. He thought about trust, about vulnerability, about the risk of opening himself up to someone who had already hurt him once. "I'm scared. I don't know how to do this." "Neither do I. But I think that's okay. I think maybe we can figure it out together." In the months that followed, they did figure it out, slowly and imperfectly, and with plenty of mistakes along the way. Nathan accepted the new position Sophie had offered, along with the better hours and the childcare assistance, and the promise of a life that was not defined entirely by work. Sophie continued to transform Hartwell Industries, implementing policies that prioritized well-being over productivity, becoming the kind of leader she wished she had been from the start. They did not rush into a relationship. They did not fall into each other's arms like characters in a movie. They built something more gradual, more real, a foundation of trust and understanding that grew stronger with every conversation, every shared meal, every evening spent watching Emma play with her blue unicorn. The day Sophie asked Nathan to bring Emma to her apartment for dinner was a milestone neither of them acknowledged out loud. They sat at her massive dining table, surrounded by art worth more than Nathan's annual salary, and they ate pasta that Sophie had made herself. And Emma talked about her school and her friends and the new drawing she was working on. "I want to show you something," Sophie said after dinner, and she led them to a room at the end of the hallway. Inside was a space that had been transformed into a child's paradise, a canopy bed covered in fairy lights, shelves filled with books and toys, a corner set up with art supplies and easels and every color of crayon imaginable. And on the wall, in a simple frame, was one of Emma's drawings, the one she had made of the three of them together, stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. "I had it done last week," Sophie said quietly, "in case you ever wanted to stay over." Emma ran into the room with a shriek of delight, exploring every corner, examining every detail, her joy so pure and uncomplicated that it brought tears to Nathan's eyes. He turned to Sophie, and she was watching Emma with an expression he recognized, because he felt it too. "I don't know what this is, what we're becoming, but I know I want to find out." Sophie smiled, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "So do I," she said, "however long it takes, whatever it looks like. I want to be here, Nathan, with both of you, if you'll have me." He answered by taking her hand, and they stood there together, watching Emma dance around her new room. And for the first time in a very long while, Nathan Rivers believed that the future might actually be something worth looking forward to.